this were a dictatorship, it'd be a heck of a lot easier. Just so long as I'm the dictator.
Welcome to Blue Blogs TV. George Bush's never-ending calls for never-ending patience with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan always remind me of our experience with our dog Shana. When she'd suddenly stopped walking one day a couple of Decembers ago, we had to take her late one night to an animal hospital clear across the state. The hospital did some preliminary non-invasive tests and gave us what few results they had. Shana was bleeding internally, and considering her age and breed, the odds of her having stomach cancer were 9-1. Then came the dilemma. If you want to know for sure, they said, you could pay an extra $1,000 to remove not the cancer, but that 10% of doubt so you can put your pet down with a clear conscience. Any loving and attentive pet owner who's ever been in our horrid predicament can understand that you never base a life and death decision on that 90%. You're going to predicate it on that much more emotional 10% chance that it could be an easily fixable bleeding ulcer. This 10% of doubt is all that George Bush has. The only thing keeping the Iraq War alive after 4 miserable years of unending, increasing pain, even as the host nation is dying. And, even as Dr. Bush is pretending to sympathize with our very private and subjective collective anguish, he's also telling us that the Democrats are trying to kill your dog. As the Democrats make funding conditional, he's talking about sanctity of life and feeding tubes and slipping into our subconscious that fat little 10% of doubt. If we pull the plug on Iraq, we'll never know if we could have truly accomplished the mission of turning Iraq into a healthy, self-sustaining democracy.
Don't let those nearly 3,300 men and women die in vain, because it'll all be your fault if you do that.
And like any good gambler, George W. Bush knows that's a hole card always worth playing, especially with over 26,000 hurting Iraq war families desperate for some validation, any validation for their pain and sacrifice. And shelving for a minute the easy and plausible accusation that we wouldn't be in Iraq if they had cornfields instead of oil and natural gas fields, let's assume for a minute that Bush is as honestly and sincerely interested in Iraq's fate and well-being as our veterinarian was dedicated to Shana's. The sense of skillful manipulation is still palatable. The doctor had relied on our love and compassion for our dog to make that emotional and costly 10% decision, because 10% of hope will almost always outweigh that 90% of near total certainty. The doctor manipulated us into the more conclusive tests, even though we were flying in the face of veterinary science, because no one wants to kick themselves in the pants for the next 30 to 40 years. And Bush is tugging at our heartstrings, albeit in a nastier, more confrontational and heartless manner, even while we're all flying in face of political science, or in Bush's case, political voodoo 101. The more pins and needles we stick in Iraq, the more efficacious. Because a veterinary hospital, after all, is a business, and so is war. And all you need to do to see if Iraq has a chance is for Congress to give me another measly $100 billion with no questions asked. Here's the difference. A veterinary hospital would have put our dog down that night if we decided not to play the long odds, and they would have done it since it would have been our legal right to put her down. With a despicable triage, George W. Bush is not giving Congress that right to pull the plug on either the funding or the war. A pragmatist can be a pragmatist without being accused of being a heartless bastard, and many people would have agreed with us if we'd put Shana down the night we took her to the hospital. This is a time for pragmatism, not the faux humanism embraced by a man who'd never fought in a war a day in his life or worn a uniform in a real military, a man who doesn't understand the moral ramifications of sending people to their death, however honorable or necessary the mission, and Iraq obviously is neither. We'd paid the extra $1,000 for the tests because we'd listened to our hearts, and the odds weren't in Shana's favor. The next day she died. We defended our decision to have the test done, and still do. We gave her an extra half a day of life, even though we couldn't be there to savor it with her, because we had to know. But Iraq is different. Every day we keep our troops there, another 2 or 3 soldiers die. 10 more died over the Easter weekend. We don't need surges and another 100 billion depleting our treasury or fancy strategies long on goal and short on policy. The backdrop of 4+ bloody years tells us at 100 decibels that we don't need any high-tech solutions to tell us what over 26,000 dead, maimed, and injured bodies can at a fraction of the cost. It's time to pull the plug on Iraq, because not only can we not solve the problems that we've created, not only can we not wait for the next administration to competently attack these problems, we are the problem. We are the cancer, and we need to cut ourselves out regardless of the prognosis. Iraq believes that it's strong enough to continue without American involvement. I do too.